Hello everybody and welcome to this special webinar. In fact, it's the first of two webinars with Specialist Housing Barrister and Deputy District Judge Robert Brown. Hello, Robert.
Hello, Tessa. Hello, everyone. I can see that there are many of you logged in for this, which is fantastic. I think we're just over 100 people already logged in. So good morning to you all. Hello to anyone who's listening later on the replay. And yes, I'm really pleased, happy to be doing this. It's something that Tessa came up with just last week, and in just under a week, or just about a week, she and I, we've been able to put this together, and we're hoping that in the next hour or so we can give you some guidance on the many bits of guidance that are out there. We are being swamped in guidance from the government and other sources, not all of which is consistent with other bits of guidance, and not all of which reflects the law. And I'm afraid the law is important in all of these things, and I'm going to try and help you navigate through some of that.
Yeah, so just a few housekeeping notes. You see that Robert has a PowerPoint there. I have loaded that up as a handout, so if you are on the live webinar, you will be able to download that. There should be a handouts tab on the panel that you'll have. If you're listening to the replay, I will make the PowerPoint will be a PDF version of the PowerPoint. It will be downloadable from probably both the Landlord Law site and the Landlord Law blog. If you can't find it, if you do a search on Robert Brown, you should be able to find it. Or if you can't find it, send me an email and I'll let you know where it is. This webinar is also to raise money for the British Red Cross, and I'm absolutely delighted to tell you that we have now raised over £1,000 for the British Red Cross, and that amount is going up as more people sign up for the webinar. And of course, people will be able to sign up for the webinar after it's taken place, because we'll have the replays.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. So thank you to all of you, and thank you particularly to Tessa and the Landlord Law team for the idea and for raising all that money. That's brilliant.
Well, I'm sure the British Red Cross will need it. If you have any questions, there is a Q&A box. So if you could put your questions in the Q&A, and at various stages during the webinar, I will put them to Robert, who will give them his due consideration and answer them. So
as best I can, at least. Anyway.
As best you can. Yeah. Robert, over to you.
Yeah, fine. Well, thank you very much, Tessa. So I should say this is done the best we can to bring this bang up to date for today, the 9th of April. Things obviously are changing all the time. I did these slides 2 days ago, and since then there have been two fairly significant changes in guidance issued by various bits and bodies, and we'll talk about those as we get to them. So things are changing all the time, but I'm going to try and give you an overview and also delve into some of the finer details of some of these things. So what are we going to be looking at? 5 key topics: repairs, energy performance certificates, gas and electricity inspections. So there's 3 subheadings within that. The tricky problem of tenants withholding rent, buy-to-let and mortgage providers, and then I'm going to talk about viewings and new tenancies, tenants moving in. And then there is a bit of a bonus of just some short information, if we have time to go through that, about the short-term let market, where actually there has been a relatively significant announcement just this morning from one of the main providers, Airbnb.
I'll just chip in here, Robert, and say that today Robert will not be talking about and will not be answering any questions about the courts and possession proceedings, because that is the subject of our second webinar, which is going to be taking place next week, which I think is the 16th of April.
Yeah, we're going to do all this again, but with some different topics next week. And again, Tessa is raising money for charity, and I think that one's going to be for Crisis, isn't it, Tessa?
That's for Crisis UK, yes.
So we will then talk about current court cases, new court cases, the changes to notices. There's a lot to cover in that one as well. So we will be doing that next week. So that's what we're going to try and get through today. And this is why. This is the context, really. And I think there are a few important things that frame this. So obviously we all know why this is. There is what has been recognised and identified as a pandemic caused by the coronavirus COVID-19. And various steps and measures have been taken in bids to control, limit the spread of that. There's lots to be said and argued by epidemiologists and sociologists about the effect of that and the adequacy of those. And that's not something that we can deal with today. But what we can deal with today is try and look at how those measures affect landlords and tenants. So the most important pressing one is the phase that we're currently in, the lockdown, as it were. Where that actually comes from are those regulations, which you see identified in the top slide, the health protection, coronavirus restrictions, England regulations of 2020. And those are made by the Secretary of State for Health, actually, and they restrict what people can do. And in particular, that's where the limit on leaving your home are set out, and the police have powers to fine people who do not adhere to those restrictions. Now that was announced by the Prime Minister a few weeks ago in his televised address. And so the regulations actually made by the Secretary of State for Health. And the initial restrictions were said to be by the Prime Minister for 3 weeks, and the regulations provide for a review. Now, it seems fairly clear, I think, to anyone who follows the news that that 3-week period or those restrictions will last for longer than the initial 3-week period. They're not going to get lifted after 3 weeks. It will be longer than that. But even when they do get lifted, there are still going to be, I think, some restrictions. It may not be as prohibitive as it currently is, but I don't think we are going to be going straight back to business as normal straight away. So that's part of the context as well. Context also, the Coronavirus Act that was passed by Parliament just before it closed. That is where you find various things, but particularly so far as residential property is concerned, that is where we find Schedule 29, which is what changes the requirements for notices for ending tenancies. And as Tessa said, we're going to talk about that next week. Also part of the context is Practice Direction 51Z of the Civil Procedure Rules. That's the one that has put a stay on possession proceedings for 90 days. Again, we're going to be talking about that more next week's session. But it is actually quite important in terms of the context for all of the things that we're going to talk about here. Because when we talk about repairs, tenants withholding rent, all of these sorts of things, what you have to bear in mind is if the tenant is withholding rent, your standard remedy of serving a notice and issuing possession proceedings, not as effective now as it might otherwise be. And I've put a fifth one about the context, which is there are lots of rules, there's lots of guidance. The guidance sometimes and the advice going further than the rules and the legislation in terms of what it's trying to prevent people from doing. I think there's a great role here just for good old-fashioned common sense. And there are certain areas that we'll get to where I think common sense might really be very important. One of them, we talk about viewings and new tenancies. I think there's a place for the rules, and I think there is a place for just taking a step back and thinking, even if this is something that I could squeeze through the legislative restrictions, is it something that I should really be doing? We'll come back to that. So that's context. Said a bit about these regulations. We all know they came into force 26th of March 2020. There is an emergency period. Say there has to be a review every 21 days, which is the 3-week period that the Prime Minister mentioned. And the first review has to be carried out by next week. Indications that it's going to be carried out probably Monday, Tuesday perhaps, but it is not going to result in the restrictions being lifted, and the emergency period will continue. And therefore, Regulation 6.1 will remain. So during the emergency period, no person may leave the place where they are living without reasonable excuse. There are, in the regulations, a number of reasonable excuses set out. And as is well known, exercise is one of them. So that is something that can be done. Interestingly, the regulations, this is something I've been waiting to see, the regulations just say a reasonable excuse includes the need to take exercise. It doesn't limit that to one set of exercise a day. Well, that's something that police and government have been advising people to do. There is another important restriction there in Regulation 5 about closing types of businesses during the emergency period. And one of the types of businesses that has to be closed is a business consisting of the provision of holiday accommodation. That obviously is apt to cover short-term lets, and we'll come back to that perhaps in due course. So those are the regulations for present purposes. The practice direction I already mentioned, as I say, there's a stay on possession proceedings for 90 days. We're going to talk more about that next week, but very significant, as I say, in terms of what you can and can't do. So that's the context. Repairs. What happens about repairs? While you are a landlord and you have a tenancy, your repairing obligations remain. And if we are talking about, as we are, residential tenancies, they are going to be primarily short hold tenancies, also some fully assured tenancies. There is, irrespective of what is set out in the tenancy agreement, a repairing obligation placed on the landlord by Section 11 of the Landlord Tenant Act 1985. Nothing has been done to change that by the Coronavirus Act, by any regulations. That repairing obligation still exists and hasn't changed for a long time. Although, as you'll see on the slides, just take this opportunity to remind you all that the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation Act 2018 has come into force, and that has changed the extent of repairing obligations in the Landlord Tenant Act 1985 by adding a new Section 9A about fitness for human habitation, and that is going to add further duties to some landlords. So repairing obligations still exist. However, there's an important point of this. The requirement on a landlord, or the obligation to repair, is only breached when there's a failure to remedy within a reasonable period. So you have to, normally there has to be notice of the need for repairs, and then the landlord has a reasonable time in which to carry out the work. And there are cases that say what is a reasonable time depends on all the circumstances. So you have to look at what are the circumstances, what is the seriousness or importance of the issue in repair. A boiler that doesn't work in the middle of winter is obviously far more significant than a very minor thing such as light bulbs needing replacing or something. Light bulbs needing replacing, the sort of thing a tenant should do for themselves anyway, normally. But it's going to depend on what it is. It's also going to depend on how long that repair would need to carry out. And the circumstances are going to, I think, have to reflect the particular circumstances in which we are living, which is, it is inevitable that certain items of repair may take longer to arrange than they would otherwise do, and that certain minor items of repair may not be so pressing that they need doing during this period, and what is a reasonable period should be extended to take account of that.
Just mention, Robert. One of our listeners has pointed out that building suppliers are closed at the moment, and contractors are struggling to get hold of supplies. So that could be another reasonable reason.
Yeah, again, that's always part of the issue anyway. Any difficulty that one might have in obtaining parts. So you can get this with certain types of boilers and lifts, which tend to be less an issue in this sort of repairing obligation, but you do get in commercial tenancies. Difficulties in repairing lifts because the parts have to be sourced from other countries. That's always factored in. And of course, again, part of the particular circumstances that we are in at the moment is that all of these difficulties may be enhanced. And indeed, even parts that would normally be readily accessible are much harder to get hold of now. And part of that as well is whether you can even get contractors who are willing to attend. There will inevitably be, I think, a proportion of the pool of contractors who are not able to come out and work. Some of them might be self-isolating, some of them may actually be ill, some of them may have additional care and responsibilities during this period. So there may be a more limited pool of contractors available. So that is one of the things that we have to bear in mind. Now, government has issued some guidance. There's a link there to that guidance, and at the end of all these slides, and if you download the PDF, I've tried to collect what I think are the most useful, important links that you may want to have. But in this guidance, the government have tried to give, and it's non-statutory guidance, so there's no sort of penalty in law for not failing, for not applying this in and of itself. But they've given guidance on notices seeking possession, so we'll talk about that next week, court action, and then property access and health and safety obligations in the context of the COVID-19 restrictions. And there's a whole section about property access and health and safety obligations. And they have given some, I think, actually relatively common sense guidance about it. And you can follow that on the link.